Hi, Katie. Welcome to Better Than Fine.
I am so excited to be here, Darlene. Thanks for asking me to be on the show.
I'm excited to have you. I'm excited to have you partly because we're going to talk about something that I've really wanted to do. I don't know, like a legit episode on. I don't want to start with like negative framing because it's not very positive psychology, but I do feel like what we're talking about today, which is self-love, gets fluffy treatment in the internet. I know I see a lot of coaches and practitioners who just kind of throw the labeling around. And in actuality, you are an actual expert on this idea. Let's just start with who you are, what you're about, like what brought you to studying self-love?
It's a great question. I think on some level, I've studied self love my entire life. I like to say the first half of my adolescence or early development was a lot of self loathing. I was kind of an overweight, chubby kid. I was a little bit of a loner. I grew up in sort of a culture that I didn't necessarily identify with, but that was my life. And so it wasn't until I moved to New York City right out of high school that I really began to understand self-efficacy, sort of what I was capable of and what was inside of me, as opposed to sort of always navigating my compass based off of what other people thought I needed to be and like never quite measuring up. Saying, if I could do anything in the world, what would I do? And I just started doing it. So I moved to New York. I decided to attend all these different Broadway plays. I mean, I saw my first Broadway show and I was just like blown away.
Mm.
Um, and before that, I just had sort of this, I call it my Empire State Building moment. You see the Empire State Building in the background of my screen because when I first got to New York City, I thought that the environment would change who I was, I was unhappy because of the people that I was around and my situation and circumstance. And what I came to discover really quick is that in New York City, I was equally just as miserable and then completely overwhelmed because I didn't know how to get around. I didn't know how to get outside of my apartment. And so, I was thinking, what do I do? Do I go home? I can't just be like this miserable. All my friends are going to college. They're moving on without me. They're pledging sororities. And just one day I said, I want to find my way to the top of the Empire State Building. And so I decided to purchase a Metro Pass, just an all day sort of subway fare. And I was going to find it on my own. And I did. It took me all day. I like ended up in Harlem. I was in Brooklyn for some time. I mean, it just was so confusing to me. This is before cell phones.
Yeah, I was going to
Um,
say for the uninitiated, because I moved to New York City in 2009, and I remember having to map all my route out because you couldn't just do Google Maps and it wouldn't just tell you go here, do that. You had to look at the timetable. That was when the first computer-based apps would show you what, like, okay, you could do this and this, but if anything went wrong along the way, you had to have like on the spot troubleshooting. And that was before
exactly.
smartphones. Like this is so what year did you move to New York?
I moved to New York in the year 2000,
Okay.
2001.
Yeah. So
So
even predating that.
yeah, this is like when they gave you a little map at the subway
Mm-hmm.
terminal, and then there was just the static maps that were on the side. And even when you go into the subway now, it's all electronic and you can see exactly where you are and what stops are coming up next. And there was none of that.
Yeah, none of that
So
existed.
yeah. So and I was living uptown, between Broadway and Amsterdam on like 111th Street, so kind of by the Columbia University. And Empire
and
State
if
Building.
and if nobody has taught you how the grid system works, and then you get out of the subway, and for anybody who hasn't lived in New York, they don't necessarily understand, or if you've only ever come here with apps, this freeze moment where you come out of the subway and you don't know what direction you're facing and you don't know what direction traffic is going. And if you don't have a naturally strong sense of direction, you're just standing in the middle of a grid that you don't know where you are.
With everything moving around you in a way that you're just like, I want to go back down into the subway, which is loud and smelly and it has its own like je ne sais quoi, but I would rather be down there than like in the hustle and bustle. Very like Oliver and Company, which is an old Disney movie.
So you find your way to the Empire State Building.
So I find my way. I see it in the distance. And I'm like, forget it. I'm not going back underground anymore. Like I'm going to the Empire State Building. I'm going to go stand on the top of it. I get to the Empire State Building. I read the placard on the side of the building and it says the Chrysler Building. So my whole life, I thought that the Empire State Building was the Chrysler Building.
Coincidentally, the Chrysler Building is my favorite architecture in New York City.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. And it's so gorgeous that I'm like, that's got to be it, right? But no, the Empire State Building. And I had never seen An Affair to Remember or Sleepless in Seattle. So I had no idea. I had just heard of these romantic notions. And I think that's one of the reasons that I was like, oh, I got to get to the top of the Empire State Building.
And the Chrysler Building is much more romantic looking. If people know, it's got that Gothic architecture with the little triangle cut-ins, and I think it's more beautiful,
shiny building. And sleek. Yeah, aesthetically I do appreciate it a little bit more, but now I have this fun sensibility to the Empire State Building. So
yeah.
And at that time the World Trade Centers were still standing, but for some reason I didn't want to go there. I want to go to the Empire State Building. So I just went inside and asked the security guard. It's like country bumpkin from Utah, Salt Lake City. I mean, not so country bumpkin, but, and I had been to New York before, but, so I just said, where's the Empire State Building? And he told me, and I got to the top of the Empire State Building and I kind of stood up there and I reflected on my day. And I really learned life lessons that day that have guided me through the duration of my life, where I felt like if I just set my mind to something, I could do it. I would need the proper support along the way, whether that was a map or that was a subway. I was probably going to get lost. And when I did, if I could acknowledge I was lost and just ask for help, then people are willing to help you. So many good people that day where I was just like, I'm looking for the Empire State Building. And they look at me with this like astonishment, like you're in Harlem, so you're not going to find it here, friend. And also, like, sometimes you set this lofty goal to go somewhere and you think you know what that looks like. And at the end of the day, you might not. And giving up the attachment to what it looks like and going and finding what's truly for you is so important. Because I could have gone to the top of the Chrysler Building, but that's not where I wanted to be. I just didn't know that.
Until you got there.
Exactly right. And that shifted everything for me. So I like to think on the top of the Empire State Building, that day I started my experiments with self-love. And that was really allowing myself to see myself, which I think is the first step. And
there's a growth mindset component here, right? The willingness to be vulnerable, the willingness to admit to yourself what you don't know. And see that, well, I have the problem solving skills. I have the tenacity. I have the, Duckworth would say grit, to get me through to the thing I actually want. If I can admit like, oh, okay, I got what I thought I wanted. I'm not going to reframe, re-goal, and get to the thing. But what I think is interesting is there's so many different variables we could pull out of this, but it ultimately led you to this concept of not just self-acceptance, but the love component. And that's what we're really going to dive into and talk about today.
I love it. And I just don't think acceptance is enough. I don't even really appreciate that word in its entirety, because I think that when you think about acceptance, there's something really finite about it. And there's almost something that feels like you're giving up. And one of my favorite thoughts and sayings, it's actually a chapter in my book, says, never give up, always let go.
Yeah, I was thinking the whole time you were saying acceptance, I was thinking surrender. But I think the other thing that's interesting in that is like the parallel in my mind is to the name of the show, right? Like when we are conditioned in our culture, when you ask how things are, I'm fine, I'm fine. Everything's fine. And I personally, I don't think I've ever said this on the show before, when I was going through my divorce, one of my mantras to myself when I would be overwhelmed would be to say, I'm fine. Everything's fine in my head, just to get myself through, to endure the necessary uncomfortable things that happen when you're dissolving a 12-year marriage. It's like, I'm fine. Everything's fine. But fortunately, then the injection of positive psychology into my life was the realization that, like, I don't want to be fine. And that's what you're describing, is like self-acceptance was just not enough for you.
No, not even self-compassion. It's interesting because I've said this before, but recently I was able to ask Kristen Neff, who is the leading researcher and probably foremost authority on self-compassion, what she felt like the difference between self-love and self-compassion is, because in the thesis that I wrote, I had to tease self-love apart from all these light concepts and constructs. And she said that self-compassion is the entryway, but self-love is the ultimate goal, the ultimate aim, which I think is fascinating. I mean, I knew what I felt like the difference between the two were, and it was interesting to hear her take on it as well.
What do you think the difference between them are?
I think a lot of self-concept deals with creating an avatar of yourself in order to be able to be okay with yourself. So saying something like, treat yourself like you would treat a friend. That is a good first step to think about, just to be able to witness how you treat yourself differently than you would treat a friend. But if you continue to tell yourself, I just need to treat myself like I would treat my friends, then you're still telling yourself you're not good enough, that you're not
still
enough.
Still an othering.
To actually see yourself as worthy of compassion. And I don't even like the word worthy or value or any of these sort of price tags we put on ourselves.
Commodification.
At some point, like, we have to be more than a utility, even to ourselves. And that's how we show our that's how we ask other people to see us in the world, is by saying, like, how can I be of utility to you, or value, or some kind of condition. And so that ends up being how we build our, like, the building blocks of our self-identity, as opposed to understanding our intrinsic, I say, human miracleism.
That's okay. We like woo-woo on the show.
Good. A lot of my research comes from and is informed by Eastern wisdom traditions, because I'm a classically trained yoga instructor. I've studied Raja Yoga for a decade and a half, which is the yoga of the mind. And I don't believe that Eastern wisdom tradition and Western psychology is actually saying anything different. They're just saying it in a different language. And so at some point, maybe there will be a beautiful, harmonious balance and marriage of the two.
Read Eastern Body, Western Mind? I bet you
have.
I bet you have.
It's actually like right in my bookshelf over there.
And for the listener who hasn't, Eastern Body, Western Mind is the marriage that Katy is alluding to, of how do we take traditional chakra based systems and then overlap them with Western psychological constructs, and where do we see the mapping in a similar way, and what are some body-based somatic practices that can help us to heal that rift from a physical embodied experience, as opposed to purely looking at it mechanistically in a Western lens, which anybody who's listened to the show before would know I am totally about. So I'm with you on that one. I think for me, I think of compassion as a response to suffering, right? Like, the nature of compassion means that there has to be a negative, or else there's no reason for compassion to exist. And in that way, compassion seems in a bit way reactive to me. Whereas if we look at love and all of the facets that, say, Barb Fredrickson talks about it as a component of all of these different positives, plus support, consistent presence, attention, awareness, that, the gift of someone caring about something in its wholeness and robustness, that is not viewing myself purely as like, oh, I need compassion because I somehow am negative reacting. You said self-loathing was your original state. I see the difference as if I am experiencing self-love, that's embracing the joy, embracing all the good juju. And then self-compassion is a facet of it, because when I suffer, I respond to myself with compassion. Any
Yeah.
thoughts on that?
I mean, I like that. I think for me, that's one of the ways we sort of tease it apart is self-compassion is coming to a place of common humanity with suffering, which is a lot of Buddhist and Eastern wisdom tradition thoughts. You have aversion and attachment, and those are sort of the root of everything. But I have a little bit of a different take, which is the idea of a common humanity through our shared human miracle. So when you look at our existence as a species on this planet, it's like a teeny tiny little sliver of the years that the Earth has even been in existence. We look for life on Mars, we're looking for life on other planets. As far away as we know, through the history of human existence, there is no other species in the entire solar system, and not just the solar system, but the galaxy, and then the galaxy and galaxies beyond. We know that if the Earth was any closer to the sun, we couldn't exist on this planet as we know it. We know if it was any further away, we couldn't exist. So whether you choose to believe a theory of the Big Bang, which is scientific theory, it's not proven, it's one theory, and there are a lot of different theories, or you choose to believe in another ideology or theology, there's really no way to answer the question, why are we here? And when you can't find the root of something like what we have on Earth, there's a term to explain it, and it's miracle. And so our existence on this Earth is one of being a miracle. So when I look at myself and I say, wow, Katy, you're a freaking human miracle. Then I look at Darlene and I'd say, if I'm a human miracle, guess what? So are you. And I'm not more miraculous or less miraculous than you, and vice versa. But we get to be together in this experience because
add a layer to that, because I think that even if I can scientifically explain something, that doesn't mean it's not a miracle. I could explain scientifically the process of conception and birth. That doesn't mean that it's not incredible when a friend that I love grows a human inside her and then brings it into this world, nurtures it, and keeps it alive. Like, it doesn't matter how many billions of times that happens. When it's someone you love and you observe it, it's incredible.
It's a human miracle.
Yeah.
It's a human miracle.
I dig it.
Yeah. So that's where I feel like self-love begins. It's where it ends. Rumi has this beautiful quote, and I say it all the time, which is, your task is not to seek for love. It's merely to seek out all the barriers you have built up against it. And so I believe when we begin with ourselves, then we can be a conscious conduit of love without expectation or exception. And that's a really special place to start. So when people say, Katy, is self-love selfish? And I say, no, it's not selfishness, it's self-fullness. It's self-wholeness. So understanding who you are in a way that's beyond ego identification helps you to see others in that way as well. And the way that you connect is not out of condition. It's literally out of an offering and receiving and this free flow of energy. When you realize you don't have the control to withhold love because you never owned it in the first place, that's amazing. And what's even more transcendent is when you realize that other people can't withhold it from you.
Because you already are it.
Exactly.
For those on purely audio, Katy just gave me the nose tap on the nose. I feel quite validated.
She got it right on the nose.
Ding, ding, ding. But I think one of the places that people really struggle when it comes to the Well, I think there's more than one place here that people really struggle. And you probably agree, and we'll hopefully have lots of things to say on it. Well, first, I find the water is just getting muddy in the same way that, I'm a person who talks a lot about self-care, right? That like we are responsible for caring for the vessel that our consciousness rides around in so that we have a vehicle to bring us to bear on the purpose that whatever it is that we're here to do, right? But social media conditions us to think that self-care is products and practices, right? Like take a bath, but do it with this, social media influencer endorsed special bubbles or whatever. And somehow that's self-care. And similarly, I see self-love thrown out there. I mean, I do it myself, right? One of my hashtags is self-care is self-love. Where do you see the waters getting muddy in that social media conversation? And how do we get underneath that to talk about it in a meaningful way?
That's such a good question, Darlene. And it's something I've asked myself over and over again, especially as, we're just scratching the surface. These studies that I'm conducting on self-love are the very first of its kind. Before whole self-love, which is the construct that was created and measured that happened.
And we're going to talk about in a second.
Self-love was just considered narcissism. I mean, Baumeister wrote about it as narcissism. W. Keith Campbell would liken it to narcissism, and all of the psychological literature, self-love is narcissism. And in a lot of the popular culture, I think people believe that as well. And now it's being sold as the cure, but nobody's telling you how to get it. Nope. So they're saying, oh, you just have to love yourself more. And for somebody who doesn't necessarily understand what that looks like, that can be one of the most confronting things to say to someone. And self-care is important, but everything begins with planting the seed of intention. So it doesn't necessarily matter what that looks like as far as self-care is concerned, or self-love. It has to come from within and inside of you. So there has to be an intention. So if you are hoping to encourage people toward self-care, then what we as human beings have to be able to do is be honest with ourselves and ask ourselves, but what is self-care to me? And there's a chapter in the book about needs versus wants, because to be able to understand what you need as a human being, and that actually needs are super, super important, and they're a valuable part of our experience with ourselves and our experience with other people, and that they actually should be fulfilled, that being needy is different than having needs, and that it's actually all welcome here in a space of observation and awareness. And knowing what that looks like different than a want is super insightful information that helps us understand, like, for me, my body is sore. What would feel really good right now? Oh, what would feel really good? A bubble bath. And what I love is the smell of lavender. It's amazing. So I'm going to do understanding that sort of intrinsic motivation toward meeting your own needs is really, really valuable. It's the work of Gabrielle Oettingen. It's WOOP. So most people know WOOP as this goal setting, really, really valuable asset, but it's all about intention. And it's actually all about observation versus evaluation. So as human beings, it's really hard for us to turn off our critical thinking mind and to see ourselves. So more than acceptance, more than surrender, I would say what's most critically important is an allowing of ourselves to be human.
Yeah, we got a lot to unpack in there, Katy. You gave the listener a lot, so I'm going to give them a lifeline here. First is Gabrielle Ottingen's work. Wish, Outcome, Obstacle, Plan is the acronym WOOP. And it's one of the most successful goal setting does a disservice, but it's goal setting with obstacle removal to move you down the field toward where you want to go, especially in the short term, like a couple of weeks time horizon. And generally the idea is that you're going to look at what's the thing I want, your wish, what happens if I get it, outcome. obstacle, what might get in my way, and plan is what am I going to do if it gets in my way? So WOOP. And
It's
that's what,
beautiful. It's a beautiful explanation. And if we could dig in just a little deeper.
yeah.
So wish is more than just something I want. When you sit in a space of observation, which is what Gabrielle says, it's not an evaluative process. If it is, you're not getting there. She calls these implementation intentions, right? So what is your wish? But your wish is more, you're creating a silence within yourself to truly see yourself, because it's a deep psychological need that you're actually seeing and hearing. And sometimes it's for the first time. And then you get to actually ruminate and envision what it would be like to meet that need. What is the outcome? You get to feel good about that. And then research shows that if you stop there, you've just had some dopamine hits and you're good, but you're gonna, you're not gonna get your wish because you're just in the dream stage. And then you look at the obstacle, but it's not an outside obstacle. It's not like, oh, it's cold outside. It's what's within you that will impede you from accomplishing or meeting your own need. It's very internal, and it's a very, very beautiful process. And then your plan is actually looking at that obstacle and turning it into a stepping stone. It's accepting life as an iterative process full of wonderful outcomes and obstacles. It's accepting ourselves, and more than accepting ourselves, it's allowing ourselves to be whole, rich, full human beings that can get whatever they want and at the same time stand in their own way. And then say, what are my healthy boundaries? What are my scaffolding? What's my plan that I am going to build to support myself? And so on the surface level, yes, WHOOP is so effective. And I believe it's effective for these reasons. We do I work with a company called Positive Voices, and we do an intention meeting every Friday for anyone who wants to come. And we spend a half an hour going over WHOOP. But really what it is, and I get emotional because it's like an opportunity to see yourself. And when do we really get that?
Yeah, I get emotional. I spent a decade in the fitness and coaching industries before I came across Ottingen's work. And when I did, I was like, why is every trainer not being taught this? We're being taught SMART goals, which, if you know the history of SMART goals, is more of a business application. And in my opinion, great for commercial endeavors and your capitalist like bootstrapping. But I don't think it's in service of any kind of internal self-directed process. I think it puts the ladder on the long wall and then forces you to climb it. Like you're saying, it makes you go to the top of the Chrysler building, even though you just realized that you want to go to the Empire State Building. And for anyone who listens, I know we have a fair number of coaches and trainers that listen to the show, that motivational interviewing certainly teaches mental contrasting tools. But what Ottingen's work has shown is that mental contrasting without the implementation intention doesn't actually get you there. Like it's better than nothing. But we've got this other tool that just isn't out there in our worlds. And I'm pretty stoked that it came up, because I'm hoping that people go Google WOOP and look into her tools, because they're really cool.
Yeah, she's an extraordinary researcher. I mean, life-changing. So.
Oh yeah, and a cool lady.
So
we
cool.
both got to meet her last year. But you had started talking about whole self, and we've started to dabble our toes in this integration idea. And I really want to unpack your ideas around whole self-love and what that means. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was doing my capstone, which is basically a thesis for my master's of applied positive psychology program, which we both took at Penn, I wanted to situate myself in the literature of self-love. And what I realized is, in order to do that, I had to take a step back and look at love. And there's an amazing early psychologist named Eric Fromm, and he wrote a book called The Art of Loving. And he talks about a whole love in that book that is free from condition, free from contingencies. That's this force of energy. People always say that love is a verb, love is an action, but sometimes love is a verb like patience is a verb. Sometimes it's the most effective form of action, but you don't actually feel like you're doing much. And but you're choosing it over and over and over again. And so sort of leaning into his work of whole love, and what really I felt like I had been experimenting with since my late teens, early 20s, came into this understanding that self-love is a tricky business. It's not something that happens overnight, and it's certainly not something that comes as a result of a bubble bath, but that it's a beautiful process of unfolding and unfolding and unfolding, and integrating in a way where you're seeing yourself. So we know that as human beings, many researchers would say that our greatest needs are to be seen and to be heard by others. But I would argue that what we're always looking for is right within us. And that's why we never really find it in other people. And what so many psychologists and psychiatrists would say, like, your interactions are actually reflections. They're reflections for you to see yourself. But in order to see ourselves, we have to understand that life is more than good and bad, and that life is more than black and white, that it's actually a union of the two, and that they inform one another more than we could ever know. And to separate them is actually not super fair, that our lives are more contextually rich than that. And in order to integrate, we have to be able to iterate, which means that life is an evolutionary process. And simple things like hurting someone's feelings, which most of us feel like it's the worst thing you could do in the world, is to hurt someone's feelings. And guess what? We all do it. I hurt people's feelings all the time. I don't mean to, but I do. If I hold on to the fact that I hurt people's feelings, and then I tell myself constantly that I'm hurting people's feelings, then what do I do more of?
Hurt yourself.
Hurt people's feelings. Yeah. And
Well, I would argue hurt yourself.
Yeah,
I mean, I think
absolutely.
any construct around people pleasing and a lot of what you've been saying, to me, I'm the bells in my mind are saying shadow work, shadow work, shadow work. Like the woo-woo side of this is talking about really getting to know the parts of yourself you've rejected and then trying to integrate them into some form of acceptance. But I think that when we go through behaviors where we're tiptoeing so carefully to try to not hurt anybody we care about, oftentimes what we're doing is denying our own deep-seated desires, our own needs, subverting our true sense of self in the sake of don't hurt anybody. And sometimes what people need is harsh lessons and real honesty.
For sure. And the more you focus on not doing something, the more you just end up doing it. And you hurt other people and you hurt yourself.
Yeah.
The world is a mirror from end to end. Everything is a reflection. And so it's letting go of the attachment to identifying as somebody who hurts themselves, or identifying as an angry person, or identifying as a loving person. I think shadow work is a good term, but also a little bit limiting, because some of these sensibilities that are within us are less about identifying them as this or that, and more identifying them as both and. So I think a lot of work has to do with boundaries and barriers, and being conscious of what those are. So oftentimes we go through life, and this comes back to the Rumi quote, when we're children and we get hurt and we feel pain, we don't have the tools at our disposal necessarily to understand what to do with it. And so in order to protect ourselves and to be able to start to continue to function, we have unconscious barriers that come up in our lives. And those establish a really rich pattern that when we're not aware of, we actually repeat these vicious patterns that came from something we just weren't able to cope with at the time. Oftentimes in psychology, what happens is it's like, well, just go start a new pattern. So this pattern isn't working for you. Go start a new pattern. I think some of the work of self-love comes from being able to excavate these barriers, to actually see them, to know that you don't need to attach or identify to them, but you do need to heal them. So if you're excavating a major barrier, then what do you need in order to allow that to heal? You need boundaries, and healthy boundaries. Boundaries are all us focused. Barriers are all other focused. Barriers come up as a means of self-protection, which then creates self-isolation. It's about not getting hurt. It's about stopping the pain. Boundaries are all about us being the best people we can be in these moments. And for us to actually build solid, stable, supportive boundaries, we have to be able to see our whole selves. And as we do that, then we begin to integrate. We begin to integrate into our wholeness, into our fullness. And life becomes more about information that helps inform our decisions and less about identification. Well, then that's who I am. And self-love, I feel like, can be the vessel and vehicle for all of these things.
Yeah, you said a few gems in there. And one in particular sticking in my mind, this idea that, we've got oftentimes it's trauma, but it can be a lot of things that create the funnel of our behavior and lead us into our repetitive cycles, right? And if those cycles happen to be destructive instead of constructive, it leads us in directions that are counter to our aligned self, right? And you introduce this idea that oftentimes when we're caught in these loops, what we do is, okay, that's not working. I'll just go off and start this whole other thing. And oftentimes we then see that people will eventually, trans-theoretical model of change, revert back into that thing that they didn't necessarily want to be. And that's why I really love these tools, these processes, Whoop being one of them, that create a sense of reflection, where instead of like, okay, here's your perfect morning stack of behaviors, I want you to just go over there, do this habit loop instead, and it's going to change your state, and then you're going to go off and you'll be a different person, which is like isn't how self-development works at all. I avoid the phrase self-help. Like I look at self-development, it's like, okay, you don't have to fix anything, you're not broken, we're just trying to evolve who you are being into who you are, right? And I love this idea that part of the self-love process is not, let's root you out of all the stuff that you're doing that you don't like and dump you into a different set of things that might not be aligned either, but instead, let's, go through the archaeological exploration of yourself, reveal the, infrastructure, the foundations that you like, that are who you want to keep, and then maybe dissolve the things that are in your way between you and you.
Well said. Yeah. And I think it all starts with mindfulness. And it's why I think mindfulness is so powerful, because it's this ability to observe ourselves. So being an objective observer of our experience is essential. And it's a really difficult practice because we have confirmation bias, we have negativity bias, we have all of these different parts of ourselves that have been conditioned to be or do or act a specific way. And so to be able to see that conditioning and also to be able to allow it, because it's all welcome here, and then from there shift it, is essential. It goes back to the trip to the Empire State Building. If I didn't know where I was, I would continue to get lost. If I didn't take the time to even recognize that I was lost, I mean, I would probably like, be in Nova Scotia or something, but
I was going to say Brooklyn, but
yeah,
even further out.
like I just keep going and going and going. Oh, the subway.
It was a lot. Yeah, it was 20 years ago.
Yeah, I'll just take a boat. Just take
What
a ferry.
what do you, I agree with you as mindfulness as a foundational place to start, right? If we don't have an awareness of where we're at, how can we choose with intention where we're going? And I think there is a kind of a current cultural precept of, oh, it's meditation, right? Like meditate. And I'm on board for that, right? I'm running a challenge right now that is about meditating. What are your go-to mindfulness practices that you use in your own practice or with people you work with?
It's a great question. There are so many. I love teaching mindfulness, and I love teaching meditation. And I'll say I believe them to be two very different things.
Agreed.
And mindfulness is the pathway to be able to understand meditation. One of my favorite mindfulness practices is a moving meditation. And it's super, super simple because it brings us back into consciousness and awareness of how something that's so habitual is actually so intricate and ornate. And that's just walking. So doing a walking practice where you just walk back and forth, but you actually feel your heel on the ground, and then maybe the arch, and then maybe the ball of your foot, and you actually watch as your body balances one leg at a time. And that walking is actually this beautiful rhythmic marriage of standing on one foot. That's the reality. And when I look at my nieces and nephews, when they like first start to walk, they fall more than they ever walk. And then at some point, you'll get to a practice where it's second nature and you'll actually forget how magnificent it is. And then you have this practice that reminds you. Breath work is the same way. I love to have people just come into their breath to understand where they're actually even taking it from. Because this is what, like, it blows your mind as a human being that, like, your inhale, your stomach's actually supposed to be accepting air into your body, oxygen, life force, prana, whatever you want to call it. Do people actually release their navel when they breathe in? 90% of the population does not. They stay up here in their chest and they hold their belly tight because that you don't want to have a big full like belly. It's horrible. And then when you exhale, are you like really releasing, really offering out all of the breath in your body? It's rare. People are afraid to actually exhale out all that breath, like they're going to drown or something. And then they inhale, take on the next breath. So as you teach people these meditation and mindfulness techniques, even just a thought, I like to think of thoughts sometimes as spider webs. So when you're meditating or you're in your mindfulness practice meditation and you're not supposed to be thinking, suddenly it's like you're Spider-Man or Spider-Woman, and like a web goes out, and then another web, and then another web. And before you actually realize what's happened, you're sitting in the middle of this like elaborate spider web. You're like, how did I get here? So once you're there, I like to ask you to start to unravel it. What was the thought? What was your last thought? And then what was the thought before it? And then what was the thought before that thought? Because then suddenly you realize how the mind works, and that though there's not a lot we can control, I don't believe you can control your thoughts. I believe that you can stop your thoughts, but I don't believe that you can control them. You get to choose. And I think we spend so much time in the need for control, we forget how important understanding our own agency is, and that most things in life are a choice. We actually don't control them. So those are some of the practices to like getting into mindfulness.
Yeah. And I'll throw out for the listener, episode 27, I believe, is the Amanda Masters episode on breath training. If you're interested in that as a work. And then if you go back, I think it's in the teens somewhere, we've got a great episode on the difference between mindfulness and meditation. With, I think, Leah D'Souza was my guest for that episode. And unfortunately, we are running up out of time. But Katy, I know you've got a book coming out that we want to mention. You've already mentioned Positive Voices. Share with us your book.
Yes. So the book that I'm working on is called Experiments in Whole Self-Love, the Art and Science of Mastering a Love Affair with Your Own Life. Basically, it's an introduction to what whole self-love is and a roadmap on how to begin to practice it for yourself. Fantastic.
And if somebody wanted to follow your work, where might they find you on the internet?
It's, I'm all over the place, but you can, I'm Positive Voices, Katy, Katy at positivevoices.com. I'm also SelfLove Sine, Sine, like my last name, trigonomic function, and sine, cosine, tangent, which is why I went on so many today, on Instagram. And if you're interested, please engage. We're doing research right now to prove predictive validity for self-love, for whole self-love. We're continuing to work on the thesis so that we can publish it in a scientific journal to show not only how whole self-love truly does impact your subjective well-being, but that it may actually be an indicator to how wonderful your life can be with it.
Super cool. That's super cool, Katy. Thank you so much for your time. Genuinely appreciate it. And we'll link to everything you just mentioned in the show notes.
Yay. Thank you.